So thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us here on DW Africa. And we just want to talk about the organization that you are heading. You put Africa's total public debt to 1.86 trillion. What went wrong with African economies to have such a huge debt imbalance?
No, thank you very much. Nothing went wrong, actually. This has been a build-up of so many years. As you recall, we had COVID-19, which was an external shock that where Africa had to borrow just to save lives. That was not an economic issue or mismanagement. Then we had climate change, which also came following that, which had a huge impact. Climate change is now costing Africa about 5% of GDP, and for some countries even more than that, especially like Mozambique, which had 15% in 2023. And then there was, because of the war, the global, especially in Ukraine, the cost went up, and that one became a big problem. And that way then it also costed the countries in terms of the devaluation of the currencies, in terms of inflation, in terms of so many things. So, and also, of course, what happened is that beyond, because the resources, concession resources were not enough in terms of lending, so most of the countries had to go private. That means issuing Eurobonds in terms of from the private sector. And because their ratings were not good, then the cost is very high. So you have that kind of combination because the countries are growing, the resources are not growing at the same rate. So that means there have to be alternatives. And that's why with that, then you find a high cost for the private lending, which is about 43% of all the total debt for African countries. Then combined with the concessional resources and all the challenges that we had. So it became very complicated. That's why they are highly indebted. And at this point, also, it happened at the time, we didn't have a solution, easy solution, like the one we used to have within the context of the Paris Club, which used to solve the problems because most of the money was owed to the members of the Paris Club. But now there are many non-Paris Club members who actually also have issued the debt. And that's why we are trying to see what the solution would be. And now there is a common framework which has a lot of issues to be improved that is now being proposed as a solution.
Yeah. Now, speaking of solutions and alternatives, how then can African countries redeem themselves and pull themselves out of this debt trap?
So that's why we are proposing certain things. Number one, there is negotiations at the global level which is happening. But on the other hand, we are looking at some domestic solutions, like domestic resource mobilization. How do we change the taxes system to make sure that we have the capacity? How do we simplify it? How do we make sure that we digitize the whole entire systems? How do we reduce the incentives that we give the private sector that sometimes we don't follow up in terms of the tax waivers and so forth? And how do we eliminate the illicit financial flows? So that becomes a big problem. If we did this, we would increase our tax really from the current lower level of 15.6%, which is quite low by any standards compared to all other regions. So, but at the same time, we are the continent that where our capital market is still low compared to others. And we are not investing heavily in the capital market. And that's why we wanted to see what can be done to build our own capital market, because that's where you get the resources which are long-term in nature for the private sector. We need government resources, but also we need to build the capacity of the private sector to invest. And that becomes a very big one. The other issue which you are promoting, which I think is very useful, is at the continental level, where we are saying we need regional value chains. We need products like minerals, agriculture, and so on, which can actually support many countries all at once. And to do that, we need to bring in the private sector. How do you bring in the private sector? It's de-risking. And there are many de-risking instruments that would help in terms of making it cheaper for the private sector to come in and support the development on the continent. And they can do that one within the context of the Africa regional, the Africa continental free trade area. And within that, because we are building a market for Africa, so that we can increase the trading. It has been around 15% for quite some time, and now want to make sure that it's no longer the 15%, but we can go up to 30, 40, 50% if we can remove all the barriers. There are infrastructure that are needed, there is a technology that's needed, there is a tariff and non-tariff barriers that are needed, but also the investment from the private sector that can increase really so that you can add value to every product that's produced on the continent. Yeah.
And you were recently quoted calling for a change for global economic policies, describing the existing international financial architecture as, in quotes, outdated, inequitable, and unjust. Please, can you explain more on that?
Yeah, because this system, financial system, was put there after the Second World War. And many of the African countries were no longer independent at the time. So they were not part of it. And when it was put there, it was just saying, come and fit in. And since we started the financing for development in Monterey, it was trying to change what they called the Washington Consensus. That means what was agreed on in 1945. It was saying the world has changed. Countries have become richer, others have become bigger. So we need to look at what you had proposed at that time and then see what needs to be changed. That's why you had the first one in Monterey, the second one in Qatar, the third one, which you had in 2015, it was in Addis Ababa, and now we are going to have the fourth one, which is going to be in Spain, end of next month. It was to see how do we reform it in such a way that it makes sense. For example, when after COVID, and IMF wanted to support countries, they issued, the SDR, the special drawing rights, and in the equivalent to 650 billion US dollars. And out of that, the whole entire continent of Africa got 34 billion. Why? Because that's their shareholding. It's equivalent to their own shareholding. Too low. Nothing has changed from 1945. Even when the countries have grown, even when the population-wise, but also income-wise, nothing has changed. The same thing with the World Bank in terms of the shareholding. So what we are saying is that there is so many things that needs to change within the financial sector, and of course the UN Security Council and other things, because if they don't change and the world has changed, then it cannot stay the status quo. It has to change. And that's why we are saying in the financial side, we are looking at several things that needs to change. But this is a discussion that has been going on within the Financing for Development, FFD4, that we have been discussing, and now there is a resolution which is almost completed in New York to make sure that we can come up with a new way this time of changing the current financing setup.